Welcome to State of the World. I'm Sally Lockwood in Dubai.
And I'm Tara Palmeri in New York.
Good to have you back, T. We missed you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I tried to take on vacation. And of course, the biggest story, Epstein, breaks. And as you know, I've been covering it for years. And it just felt like one of those moments where you really can't take a vacation. And it's been an incredible story. I feel that it's a good thing that it's come back to life. A lot of people are like, why won't this go away? And it's like, it wasn't supposed to go away because there was never justice for the victims. And I think the American people and the global community can feel that. And they know that you can't just sweep things like this under the rug.
You're one of the most knowledgeable journalists on this subject because of all the work you did recording that podcast with a brilliant podcast with Virginia Giuffre, the most famous of his victims.
And that was the thing that was so special about Virginia was like she was such a singular voice for so long, calling for justice, even when no one would pay attention to her for decades, really, even before the Miami Herald reopened the case. And in that way, like, I feel like the drumbeat is still alive for her. And they keep saying, like, release the Epstein list, the list. There was no list, but the victims had lists. And why are they going to interview Ghislaine Maxwell in prison and try to cut a deal with her when they should be just talking to the victims? They have all the secrets.
I have to say, it was always a question of mine. Why did Ghislaine Maxwell not just dish the dirt to the Department of Justice and cut a deal for a reduced sentence, hand over all these seemingly powerful names that are in the Epstein files? You know, if she didn't do it then, why would she do it now?
First of all, I've always believed that Ghislaine Maxwell did not believe she would serve a full 20-year sentence. And I think she was waiting for the right moment to strike because she had all the cards, right? She was very shrewd. You know her father, Robert Maxwell. He was a larger-than-life presence in the UK, where you're from. She kept people's secrets for a living. She blackmailed them with Jeffrey. I believe that she was waiting for the right moment, even possibly for the right moment politically, to make this move. And I do think if she's able to talk now but avoid the third rail, Donald Trump, that might be very beneficial to her, and she might end up seeing a pardon at the end of his term or some sort of leniency or clemency. But like, when you've got that, you've got to be strategic. And I think at the time of the sentencing and around the time of the charges, I don't think they were interested in giving her a deal. At that point, people wanted justice because Jeffrey Epstein had just died. They wanted a head on a platter, and she was the person. Like, the pitchforks were out. And I think she assumed that eventually that sentiment would quiet down and that she would be able to use the information that she has. Also, they have a lot of information already. They don't necessarily need Ghislaine Maxwell because, like we said, there are 1,000 victims.
And why is the Trump administration not releasing the files? There's so much pressure on them to do so by MAGA, by Make America Great Again fans. You know, and what is it doing to their support for Donald Trump, the fact that they haven't released these files?
I think it's eroding his support. It's just a very basic story. I don't think it's a red or blue story. I think it's a right and wrong story. And they were promised this. He was long, used this conspiracy theory to advance his political causes. And it's not a conspiracy theory. Like, that's the other thing. I hate when people say it's a conspiracy theory because some people are conspiratorial about it. His CIA connections, was he an FBI informant, et cetera, et cetera. This is a story about two-tier justice. And he promised his supporters, MAGA, many of whom come from the other side of the tracks, come from the other side of the intercoastal, where Jeffrey Epstein went and preyed on these young girls. This is a story of the global elites preying on the poor. And the poor and vulnerable, they want their justice. And Trump said, I'm like you, but I'm protecting you from them. But this story suggests that he's just like them and that he's a part of the protected class. And so that's where the rub is.
Some of you may remember Christopher Steele. He is the former MI6 spy who was a spy in Moscow for a number of years and then ran the Russia desk in London for MI6. And he was the author of the Steele Dossier, which was leaked in 2017, that explosive dossier that proved very controversial, alleging Russia colluded with the Trump team to help him win the 2016 presidential election, along with other many salacious claims that has angered Donald Trump over the years. Hi, Chris. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, I just want to begin by teeing up what we're about to talk about by showing some footage from inside the Oval Office in the last week or two, because Donald Trump has dropped your name live on television several times. Let's just take a listen.
The Steele report was a disaster. All lies, all fabrication, all admitted, an admitted fraud. She paid $12 million, and the Democrats, for that report to a wise guy named Christopher Steele. He wrote a phony report, and they wanted to get that report in before the election. And I'll tell you what, I talk about all the time, the fake news, how bad it is. But in this case, they wouldn't do it. They saw it, they read it, and they said, we don't believe it. And it was only after, substantially, like a month and a half after the election, that it got printed, and it was a big wisp. It was just like a bang of nothing, because the election had ended. If that report had gotten published by the New York Times or somebody, and I respect the Times for maybe only this, because they're crooked as you can be. They're a terrible paper, a crooked, corrupt paper. But for this one moment, they said, this is bullshit, we can't put this in.
Okay. Now, I guess my question, Chris, to kick off with, is why is Donald Trump talking about you all these years later when actually he's under pressure over Epstein?
Yeah, I think it's quite strange, particularly as since he lost 2 court cases against us, one in America and one in Britain, that he's actually gone very quiet on me and my company and our supposed misdeeds. So to resurrect this, it feels a bit like Groundhog Day in 2017, in that he's banging on about a lot of things which are untrue, of course. I mean, just to set the record absolutely straight from what he said yesterday, we were paid $165,000 for this project, which is the standard rate for what we did, not $12 million. And the dossier was actually leaked to the media by a card-carrying Republican. In fact, someone who served in a very senior job in a Republican administration. So you can see how utterly ridiculous what he's saying is. But I think you've got to ask at a deeper level why he's linking Epstein with us and Russia and what he calls Russiagate. And I think there must be something going on in his head in terms of linking those things. And that's perhaps what we can talk about today.
So what do you think is the connection? You still work in the intelligence community, Chris, and I know that you've studied this relationship between Robert Maxwell, Epstein, and now the scrutiny surrounding Donald Trump's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. What's your theory?
I don't really have a theory, but what I would say is that I think underlying this maybe is a consciousness that the Russians might have access to Epstein-related materials. And I think there are 2 ways in which that may well have happened in the past. One is, and you'd have to go back a long way on this, it is said that Epstein and Robert Maxwell had a business relationship of some sort in the 1980s, going into the early 90s, before Maxwell died on the yacht, you'll remember. And that at that time, Maxwell introduced Ghislaine to Epstein, and that's maybe how they actually met in the first place. I swear I've seen a photograph that relates to that period.
There's a picture of Robert and Epstein at the Plaza Hotel in New York.
Yeah, and I think I've even possibly seen one of Ghislaine as well as the other 2, but I can't seem to find them on the internet. You wonder.
Yeah, I've never found that one because we've always struggled to actually confirm the fact that the father introduced them. But there is a feeling that Epstein laundered his money after death to take care of the daughter.
Okay, so going back into the 80s, what I think Robert Maxwell was up to, and have good reason to believe he was up to, was under the sort of umbrella of freeing the Soviet Jews from the Soviet Union and taking them to Israel. He was doing the Russian government various favors. And in fact, if you're aware of Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, it does deal with all this. In that towards the end of the Soviet Union, a small elite unit was set up to basically launder Soviet Communist Party hard currency into the West in order to protect it in case the country was reformed or collapsed. And Robert Maxwell was definitely involved in that operation. And I think it's quite credible to believe that if he was working at the time with Jeffrey Epstein, that Jeffrey Epstein was also involved in that operation. And that would put the sort of Epstein-Russia link back to the late 1980s, as early as that, something we can debate. So that would be one thing. And secondly, much more recently, you'll be aware of this guy, this strange American, John Dugan, who effectively defected to Russia in 2016, who'd been a detective, I think, down in Florida, and had claimed that at the time he had access to Epstein-related investigative materials and so on. It seems very odd that somebody based in Florida, even though he was potentially going to be prosecuted for other offences, would up and leave and go to Russia, and even more strange that the Russians would welcome him with open arms. And you can't help feeling that probably he had something to offer them, and that may well have been material and information relating to the Epstein case.
And so what is the connection, do you think, in Donald Trump's mind, between the Steele dossier and the Epstein files? Because he seems to be mentioning you and the dossier when he's questioned about the Epstein files at the moment. So where does that connection come from?
Well, there must be a connection with Russia and, the whole issue about what Russia might have on him and might have on other Americans, senior Americans from that era. You can argue it's just deflecting, but actually to compare the Epstein files, which are obviously very real and very serious, with the dossier and the Russia investigation of 2016-17, actually probably lends credence to the latter, which doesn't seem to be his overall objective. I just don't think it adds up. And I think that the only way it does make any sense to me, at least, having looked at this being repeated several times, is that there is a connection in Donald Trump's mind between Russia and Epstein. And I think that's what we need to think about.
And have any of your sources, I know you can't reveal too much detail, but do you have any intelligence that suggests the Russians have this evidence that was in the Epstein files? They have this compromising material?
I think Maxwell was working for any number of security and intelligence services, yes. And I think anyone that was involved in exfiltrating Soviet Jews to Israel from the Soviet Union must have been cooperating, obviously, with both the Israeli government and probably the intelligence services.
I always thought that Jeffrey Epstein was likely to be a CIA tipster, perhaps Mossad tipster. I never thought that he was an agent analyst type, but I believe that if he was, traveling around, spending time with Ehud Barak, meeting very powerful people, the Prince Andrew, heads of corporations, that he was likely, trying to play both sides of the law, right? Trying to build insurance because he knew that he was up to no good. And it's really hard to connect the dots. I spoke to a lawyer who interviewed his bodyguard, and his bodyguard said that he would go to Langley to pick up information to give to Epstein. Does this sort of check out? Would this seem like something that a person like Epstein would do? Try to, provide information to intelligence services to perhaps get leniency, or, like how mob bosses or mafia dons give are informants, even though they're still running the mob.
And I think also, if you're working for one or two intelligence services, why not work for three or four? That we've seen that certainly in my career. I've observed that kind of pattern.
You two are the experts on this story, much more than me. There's lots of question marks when it comes to how Epstein acquired his wealth. How did he go from maths teacher to billionaire financier without some sort of career history to speak of?
If you go back to sort of origins of wealth and everything with Epstein, if there are gaps there, they may well be filled by this very large amount of Soviet assets and wealth that came out towards the end of the 1980s. I certainly think that's how Maxwell was funding himself at the time. And of course, it's said that Ghislaine was basically his chosen heir in terms of his business and other political contacts.
He said it on the record. He said, my family will get nothing. He said this in an interview. The only people who will get money are my youngest son, I'm blanking on his name right now, who he felt like was most like him, and Ghislaine, who was his friend. But I was wondering, do you have any evidence to suggest that Epstein was an intelligent asset, or at least a tipster at the very least?
No, as I say, nothing specific, although, as I say, Maxwell definitely was. And, that association, to my mind, looking at it through the lens of an experienced intelligence officer, suggests that was what was going on.
I think what a lot of people do in the intelligence agency is, and I'm not saying this from experience, but he had secrets on people. He created this bacchanal type of experience. Ghislaine Maxwell helped make it seem posh and normal with her pedigree. And then he had Kompromat, essentially, right? I mean, he then at the end, he's like, okay, you have to invest in my fund. And they would be like, wait, what? And he's like, that girl was 15. You know what I'm saying? Like, or he would be like, that he knew that what what they were up to was disreputable and that he could use it against them.
Yeah, and it's the MO of the old KGB. This is how they operated, as we know. They used more stick than carrot, although there was always an element of both in play. So it kind of strikes me that his MO was almost that of an intelligence officer from an unpleasant regime like Russia, and there definitely sort of overlaps here from what you're saying.
I mean, this is based on interviews I've had with victims, but just seeing the pattern and hearing to people talking about him, it didn't seem like that sophisticated of an operation. I think sometimes Epstein gets more credit than he deserves. I think he laundered money, but I also think he used blackmail regularly, and he used the girls as pawns in his blackmail scheme.
Yeah, and frankly, the KGB often wasn't very subtle in the way it operated. So again, I wouldn't say that's a counter-argument for this. It does strike me that this is something that people should be turning over and looking into in some detail. Just to establish, for example, whether Ghislaine Maxwell first met Epstein through her father or not. I mean, that's your first starting point, I would have said.
It's been so difficult to try to, I mean, I've spent a year investigating Robert Maxwell, and it's just really difficult to establish that connection, that he was the one to introduce them. I mean, it's like thought to be, like you said, it's presumed, but there's no clear-cut evidence. But all we know is that after Robert died, Ghislaine ends up in New York in Epstein's arms, living in a $20 million mansion.
Yeah, and as you say, she was quite clearly the successor for Maxwell in all his various business and other dealings, government dealings. So it all adds up to quite a powerful kind of theory, really, I think.
Yeah, and he actually sent Ghislaine out there to do some of his business. Like she would sell corporate gifts. I mean, what does that even mean? But he looked at her as a very shrewd operator like him. She was beautiful. She was disarming. And he was very proud of her. He brought her around and treated her like he was his wife, almost like how Trump is with Ivanka. He liked that you would see her on his arm and the wife over in the corner.
Yeah, I know. I've seen those photos, and that's very odd. I mean, it just doesn't strike you as normal behaviour.
No.
And Chris, if Russia does indeed have the Kompromat on the Epstein files, does that potentially unlock the mystery as to Donald Trump's sympathy towards Putin for all these years?
Well, we were talking about it earlier. I don't think it's quite that simple. I think Trump admires Putin.
But the question has always been, what has Putin got on Trump?
Yeah.
Could this be it?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, I do believe he has things on Trump, but I also believe that Trump admires Putin and wants to run, as I've said, America in the way that, as an oligarchy, in the way that Putin's running Russia.
Yes, agreed. I do think that as well. He's always admired him. And I think he's the one leader he's actually afraid of.
Well, that's very odd because Putin's a very sinister man, but he's sitting on a country which is declining in its power and influence in the world almost by the week. He has an set of armed forces that have failed to prevail over a second or third rate power on its border, which is not a great, role model to hold up for any country. And I think that the Chinese in particular are very conscious of that. And I'm surprised that, Trump looking at this, not wanting to be associated with losers and all the rest of it, is quite so, euphoric about Putin, or at least has been until very recently, described after all, was it not the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as an act of genius at the time? I think that was the quote. Coming back to haunt them all.
Chris, do come back again. And thanks so much.
With pleasure. Good to see you.
So, T, that's the first time you've spoken to Chris Steele. I've interviewed him a number of times. He is someone that I used to WhatsApp from the Sky News studio when I was on air, whenever there was a breaking Russia story, and I would I'd get him down the line, or I'd get him to give me, information or his analysis. So I always find him a fascinating chats. So on the Epstein story, which I know is going to consume your week again this week and probably next week as well, T.
Yeah.
You are such an expert.
Probably until the Republicans come back. And then when they don't release that, when they don't do another hearing or they don't release the files, I don't think it's going away,
Okay,
by
so
the way.
just explain why. Why is this not going away for Donald Trump? Why are MAGA so fixated on these files?
I don't even know that it's necessarily MAGA anymore. I think they're starting to give him slack. I just think the more you give them piecemeal and you don't give them the full Monty, which they were basically promised, it's like they're just trying to release the pressure valve bit by bit, but it just doesn't work. I mean, people were expecting all of it. What are you trying to hide? MAGA has long been conspiratorial. Give them everything. That's what you said you would do. And so that's where I think that they're going to be dealing with a lot of blowback.
And if Trump doesn't give them what they're asking for, essentially the Epstein files, is this going to become a problem for him? How much of a problem?
It already is. I mean, 49% of Republicans, according to a CBS poll, say they're unhappy with how he's dealing with the Epstein files. That's not a good number. We're going into a midterm election. People who vote in those elections tend to be more MAGA, very hardcore base voters. Yeah, this was really, really poorly handled. It's a scandal of their own making. It is a scandal of their own making.
But it's one of those stories that you kind of don't see coming as being the downfall of someone, a bit like Hillary's emails, before the 2016 election.
Which they're trying to bring back to life. They're like resurrected.
There was Hillary's emails that were then, exposed by the FBI just weeks before people voted, which I didn't see coming and was just extraordinary. And then you've got now the Epstein files really causing big problems, it seems, for Donald Trump. And I just wouldn't have guessed this.
In fact, I was doing a lot of interviews before it actually dropped. And on the day it dropped, I had done a few days earlier an interview with the Daily Beast. And I was explaining, they're lying. There's no Epstein list. They obviously don't know what they're talking about. This is they're in over their head on this story. Pam Bondi is and I was explaining it, and literally that weekend, and it just exploded. But yeah, and I had called law enforcement sources earlier, and I was like, what are you guys going to do? Are you working on cases? And they said, yeah, we are. We have footage, we have pictures. And then kaput. And I went back to that source and I was like, what the hell? Why did you say that you were working on stuff? And it's like, we handed what we could to the DOJ and we left it to them. I was like, wow, okay. So somebody said, shut it down.
Wow. Interesting. T, we'll definitely be talking about this again. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for grabbing Christopher Steele. That was interesting.
Yeah, it's really good listen. Really good listen. T, great to have you back. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for watching. We'll see you next week.
And subscribe, rate, share it with your friends. Your support means so much to us. And this is how we keep providing content for you.
And growing as an independent channel. Thank you so much, guys. See you next week.